Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Is an arms embargo and sanctions on Israel the only way to prevent a genocide in Gaza? Let's get to the bottom line. After half a year of continuous bombing, Israeli leaders say they are still far from stopping the war in Gaza. Israel's allies say it's a legitimate war because Israel faces a threat from Hamas and is acting in self-defense. But international law experts say something different. They say nothing justifies what's been going on, whether it's Israel's killing of so many innocent people, its use of food as a weapon of war, or the decimation of all civilian life in Gaza. No schools, no homes, and soon no hospitals. So what can be done to stop the death and destruction? And what damage is being done to the credibility and legitimacy of international law itself the longer this war goes on? Today we're talking with Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. Francesca, thank you so much for joining us today. I am looking forward to this conversation. Look, you were recently presenting your report at the UN Human Rights Council, and you stated that the threshold indicating the commission of the crime of genocide has been met, and you called for an arms embargo on Israel. Can you go into greater detail about what that threshold is?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. I've been studying what has happened in Gaza and to Gaza for the past 5 months, over 5 months. And I didn't start this investigation thinking that I would conclude that Israel has committed the crime of genocide or acts of genocide, but eventually I couldn't do otherwise. Because first of all, I've studied the acts that Israeli forces have committed: mass killing, mass infliction of physical and bodily harm, to an extent prevention of birth, and the creation of conditions that would lead to no other outcome than destruction and death and impossibility to continue civil life in Gaza. And all these constitute genocidal acts if supported by the intent to destroy the people in Gaza in full or in part. And I found this intent not only as it had already been amply documented by the South Africa legal team before the International Court of Justice a couple of months ago, through the oral statements that had been made by people with command authority in Israel, political and military leaders, but also emerging from the conduct of soldiers on the ground who had internalized, absorbed, and acted upon those words, those orders, like the call, the evocation of Amalek, go Amalek, destroy all the Amalek, and including women and children, or there are no innocent people in Gaza, or we have to eradicate everyone who's Hamas. And eventually no one is innocent in Gaza. This has reverberated on the actions of soldiers, infantry on the ground, or those who have bombarded and destroyed 70% of the Gaza civilian infrastructure. But what is the most important finding in my report is what I call the humanitarian camouflage of Israel's genocidal logic. I argue that Israel has not denied all these, the killing and the mass destruction. It has just justified it as in compliance with international humanitarian law. For example, the use of human shields. Israel has used human shields as a concept that can be expanded ad infinitum. So everyone was considered a human shield. But this has been done by Israel in previous wars in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2022, 2023. And it had been demonstrated either a fabrication or an excuse, and this time was not different. Every time in international humanitarian law, the concept of human shields is used is to be demonstrated. You cannot, as an occupying power, you cannot, as a part in conflict, kill everyone and say, well, they were human shields. Because this is also mirrored by the another humanitarian concept, which is collateral damage. You know, international humanitarian law is not a super protective legal regime. It's just to prevent the most violent effects of war and to protect those who are not involved in conflict, which has not spared anyone in this current operation.
Right.
Because everything has been considered collateral damage, and also evacuation orders, safe zones, warning. So all this language has been used to camouflage the genocidal logic of full destruction that has led to this operation.
Francesca, what does it say about the state and the solvency of international law today? I am very impressed that you presented your report, that you've had both critics, particularly the U.S. State Department, but also those that have applauded your bravery at this moment. But do you believe that your findings will be acted upon? Do you believe that the mechanisms within the United Nations and within the institutions of international law are going to create real penalties for Israel right now? Or is this will we see an erosion of international law by the failure to act?
There is no question that we also see an erosion of the capacity of international law to be enforced. I often say something that true that international law without the strength of political will is like dead letter, but politics that free themselves from the limits and the constraints of international law can be criminal. And this is what we are looking at today. So there is an erosion of the international law system, the multilateral system, that does not allow to have any realistic forecast, because I do see the impact of my work and my report. Let's look at this genocide, Anatomy of a Genocide report. A few days after I presented the report, the members of the Human Rights Council passed a resolution on accountability that inserted specific language that I had recommended, an arms embargo on Israel. Nonetheless, who's going to enforce that? I mean, it is important that capitals align with that. There has also been a resolution of the Security Council asking for a ceasefire. There have been several provisional measures recommended by the International Court of Justice, and those provisional measures are compulsory, are binding on everyone. So the fact of neglecting, disregarding, or overtly violating international law only weakens the system, because it creates precedents for others to violate it.
What culpability do nations have that supply Israel with the weapons it's using? SIPRI has a report out saying that basically over the last decade or so, Germany supplied almost 30% of Israel's weapons, the United States about 66% of Israel's weapons. What's your view about the culpability of other parties in this?
Well, the hypothesis of complicity is there, because the Genocide Convention is very clear. It prohibits any form of aiding and abetting the conduct of state that might be committing genocide. So providing weapons that likely to be used in the current hostilities that translate into genocidal act might be seen as complicity. The moment that it's clear that there is this risk, there is the ICJ telling states, excuse me, to take all measures, all possible steps to make sure that the genocide is prevented. And not only those measures are not taken, but also steps to continue to fuel that genocidal practice are taken. Well, I think that it leads the hypothesis of complicity to become very, very real.
I guess makes me ask the question about how jaded we have become to these kinds of conflicts and to the moral questions involved. And you've been in the middle of a storm. But I'd be interested in your perspective on the rest of us that are watching this and what our responsibility is to better document and highlight these moral moments, not just when a celebrity chef's workers are killed, but everyone else that's killed and has been dying along the way.
Look, I mean, the killing of the 7 aid workers of WCK is surely a tragedy. There is no, and a crime. There is no question about that. But it's also part and parcel of a very complex, intricate criminal scene, which I couldn't describe otherwise than a genocide implemented with modern means and methods of warfare. It's interesting that the fact of having internationals killed brought the attention back to the fact that and no one is safe in Gaza, including humanitarian workers. There are over 190 humanitarian workers who have been killed in Gaza in the past 6 months alone. 175 of them are UN staff members. So, and the fact that there are no many foreigners there has created this sort of alibi. Yeah, but in any case, they're Palestinians. Yeah, but they are Palestinians, academics, lawyers, human rights defenders, journalists, scientists, 13,000 children. I mean, it's so brutal, it's so monstrous that I probably have given 300 interviews by now, and still every time I say how many children have died in this carnage, something inside me breaks because it's abnormal. So no, we don't get, some of us don't get used to this, but I do recognize the sort of immobilism of Western societies, and this is because we have privilege to thrive in, and it doesn't touch us, which speaks of our humanity, because, I've also often said this is a moment where everyone should give away a little bit of their own privilege and their own comfort so that someone else doesn't have to renounce it all. And we are still there with this fight, existential fight about our humanity.
You're a real expert on genocides and have studied other genocides, as we know from your report, Bosnia in the 1990s, the Rohingya in Myanmar. I'm reminded that about 30 years ago, the Rwanda genocide against Tutsis took place. And when I've looked into the Rwanda genocide, I was surprised at the systematic planning that had previously occurred before that date on April 7th when that started. And then I was disturbed greatly by the slowness of global reaction, of bureaucratic reaction, and even at the United Nations, where the United Nations had been warned and told in advance of what was happening. The UN gave instructions not to do anything. I'm interested in that element of how this particular act in Israel, Gaza, compares to those.
It does and it does not, in the sense that in many respects, I've learned through the past months also digging into genocidal or genocide-related literature that genocide, it never comes as unexpected. It never. It's not an act. It's a process. So it's not just the act of killing. It's the act of killing aiming to destroy a population. And there were writings on the wall, so to speak, in the case of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. In this respect, probably it's not different. The level of dehumanization, the role that has permeated the political sphere, the role that the media has played is significant in portraying a given narrative. But here are the differences. I mean, this genocide, as the legal team of South Africa aptly said, is the first that is documented by its own victims and broadcasted in real time. This is quite unique. So there was not the month delay between the occurrence of a genocide and the act of the realization of it at the level of public opinion. So it's, yes, what you said is true. The UN were unable to prevent the genocide in Rwanda. The UN were unable to prevent the genocide pretty much everywhere, including in Myanmar and in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Maybe not, they have in other cases, but not this one for sure. And what is shocking is that in this particular case, there has been an amplification of Israelis' political rhetoric, the justification of the war, the existential threat represented by the Palestinians, the fact that this was an anti-Semitic attack. But I mean, I conclude that there was also some anti-Semitic sentiment, but I don't think that the hatred that might have fueled the attacks against Israeli civilians is generated by anti-Semitism. There is no evidence of it. Rather, there is evidence of the contrary, that they have reacted against Israel as an occupying power and as an apartheid state, which doesn't justify the crimes, of course, but understands helps understand the context. And there has been also the role of Western media in sort of sanitizing the language. And still, they keep on doing that with 33,000 Palestinians killed, 70,000 missing, probably dead under the rubble. They keep on talking of famine looming on Gaza. Well, this is a man-made starvation. It's intentionally caused, and so the catastrophe has sort of an authorship in Gaza, and there is not enough integrity and moral courage to denounce it.
The State Department spokesman Matthew Miller kind of attacked you and said the United States did not support your appointment, said that you characterized some of your comments as anti-Semitic in this. I've been trying to sort of navigate what is a more constructive stance and engagement strategy for the United States in this than what we've been seeing. And what do you do given the kind of statements that we heard from Matt Miller about your work?
Look, I found the U.S. spokesperson's comments about me so obviously predictable for someone who doesn't have arguments, and even his body language was telling, I don't know what to say, so let me blame her because it's so convenient. This is how I read it. And so, I mean, he's been completely lambasted on social media. He's received letters and requests for resignation by many, including authoritative intellectuals and Jewish scholars. And so, it speaks for itself, and is the usual rhetoric of throwing allegations of anti-Semitism at anyone who dares criticizing Israeli practices. Do I have the time to engage with this kind of behavior? No, I don't. At the same time, the fact that it comes from a U.S. official, by the way, an official of a government who's providing weapons and who's probably going to be found complicit in atrocity crimes in not too long, who knows? But the fact that such a statement comes from a U.S. official is disparaging, because he has no idea of the pressure, clearly has no idea of the pressure that this mandate is under, also because of the lies propelled by people like him. And I have no means to make sure that everything is controlled, because what can I do to protect myself? The number of threats, the number of attacks against me has increased. How do I navigate what is serious from what is not? It takes one insane person to activate that mechanism of defense of a people from an existential threat that might be identified in me. You see what I mean?
Right.
So,
well, let me ask you finally, one of the other things we saw was after concern that a few employees had been complicit with Hamas in Unrwa, and the United States and many other nations suspended support for Unrwa. And for those who don't know, UNRWA has this incredibly large footprint in social services throughout Palestine and in other parts of the region as well, supporting refugees in Jordan and Syria, et cetera. And I'm interested in whether the failure of the United States and Germany in particular to reverse their views on UNRWA, which is I look at as got to be a vital part of like the next Palestine, whatever it is. How you see that at the moment? Many of the European nations that originally joined that boycott have since reversed themselves. And I'm interested in, from an international law perspective, is there some complicity or some crime in not supporting the UN institution and activity that delivers most aid, sustenance, medical supplies, schooling, etc., you name it, within Palestine?
Yeah, I think there is margin to investigate complicity of, first of all, the responsibility of Israel in trying to destroy Unrwa, which is the only agency who has the capacity to deliver aid in a sort of organized manner to the affected population in Gaza. The reason why the WCK was delivering food from the sea is one of the effects of Israel's continuous attacks on Unrwa, which has been amplified by member states who have irresponsibly suspended their funding of agents their funding to the agency on the basis of allegations from a state who has a track record of lies after lies after lies. But even if the allegations were confirmed, Unrwa had already terminated those staff members against due process just to protect the reputation of the agency. But what was the responsibility of the agency? Why should have the agency responded of the acts of some individuals? Where was the causality nexus? So it was completely nonsensical and irresponsible. All the more as this decision to suspend funding to Unrwa was taken the day after the International Court of Justice had issued its provisional measures, asking for unfettered humanitarian aid, which again could only be delivered by Unrwa. So yes,
Right.
Of course they were somewhat complicit.
Well, listen, this has been a sobering conversation, but we'll have to leave it there. Francesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? I need to admit that when it comes to the Gaza Strip, the bottom line is increasingly just difficult to see. On the surface, Israel seems willing to continue this war and has enough support to brush off calls for a ceasefire. The destruction of massive amounts of Gaza's educational institutions, its healthcare system, its private businesses, culture, and residential life just don't align with the stated objective of just going after Hamas. Under U.S. pressure that finally seemed to click in, Israel is letting in more aid trucks. But it's clearly not doing so because the International Court of Justice warned that it should do so and should do so immediately back in January. None of the major factors that have led to the killing of 33,000 Palestinians, a massive proportion of whom are innocent children, women, and men, are changed. There are no red lines, and morality isn't a factor. The bottom line is that there is no bottom line until Israel's onslaught ends. Maybe then a reckoning will begin. And that, sadly, is the bottom line.